Good afternoon, and welcome to the audio lecture on Chapter 13 and the urban environment. Today I'll be doing something a little bit different than normal. In most cases, I've made an audio lecture of the entire PowerPoint presentation, but in this case I'm just going to do a snippet of audio for a particular section of the lecture. This section of the lecture is about redlining, and is not within the chapter itself, and therefore I want to call it out kind of specifically. However, the rest of the chapter is fairly straightforward. Much of the PowerPoint here is quite straightforward, and I think by reviewing both the chapter and the PowerPoint, you'll be able to come away with the essential and critical points. Of course, as always, please reach out if you have questions or want clarifications. But I think this information is fairly straightforward. So as I said, I wanted to highlight a particular issue and an important issue that's not covered in our textbook, but that I think should be, and that is the issue of redlining. And this is an issue that has great bearing, great relevance on urban issues, particularly within the United States. So redlining is the systematic denial of various services to residents, communities, or neighborhoods, often racially associated, either directly or either kind of a direct denial of services, or through the selective raising of prices, in which case we're talking primarily about financial services such as banking or insurance. Financial redlining in the U.S. began with the Federal National Housing Act of 1934, which established the Federal Housing Administration. So this redlining actually was started at the federal government level, right? And this act, the National Housing Act of 1934, notice the date there. This is only a few years after the financial crisis of 1929. The stock market collapsed, and kind of we're squarely in the middle of the Great Recession here. And so the National Housing Act and the Federal Housing Administration was created, and they basically created or incentivized, not incentivized, but created for these residential security maps. These were drawn to indicate the level of security or safety for real estate investments within the surveyed cities. So not everywhere, but most of the U.S., much of the population was covered by these residential security maps. They went from type A to type D, green to red. The green type A neighborhoods were those that were the newest or the best, whereas the type D were older, typically black neighborhoods. And this was essentially kind of this gradation going from most desirable to least desirable, or most desirable to risky real estate investments. Now, as I said, this happened across the entire country, and you can see a map of where some of this redlining occurred, thanks to this huge, tremendous kind of geographic work done by the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. And so this is an interactive map that you can go and visit, and I've pulled up, kind of highlighted the map on Charlotte. And you can actually go in and click on this map, and kind of scroll through it to see the original redlined map, residential real estate security map, overlaid on today's current map of Charlotte. And there are other places in North Carolina where this was done as well, including Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Durham. And there are lots more resources here that I've linked to, just a few of them down below. Okay, so these maps then, these real estate security maps, were essentially used to deny loans to people living in zones B, C, or D, basically anything but zone A. Okay, but primarily this was used to deny these housing loans primarily to blacks in the redlined zone D neighborhoods. The direct impact of this was that people were unable to get loans to purchase homes, or they had worse terms of repayment, which ultimately affected home ownership rates, So differential home ownership rates between blacks and whites, home values, and people's credit scores. This practice was actively encouraged by the government, right? It was created from the Act in 1934, and then largely conducted or carried out by the private banks and lenders, and has to some extent continued into today. And the practice has spread from banks to insurance companies and even into kind of grocery chains and liquor stores will like place their use these maps to help place the location of their new liquor stores. So one of the primary impacts of the redlining was that it increased or furthered racial segregation within the U.S. and throughout the entire U.S. Another impact is that it was a substantial contributor to the black-white wealth gap in the U.S. Essentially, it lowered the rates of black home ownership, made it harder for blacks to own homes, and therefore they were not able to accumulate wealth. Right? And so wealth, remember, is a measure of net worth. And this is quite different than yearly income. Wealth, this net worth of families, provides for economic mobility, financial security, and inheritance, right, to be passed on from generation to generation. Right? So in 2016, the median wealth of black and Hispanic families was only $17,000 roughly and $20,000 roughly, respectively, compared to white family median wealth of over $170,000. And so you can see this was there's a huge black-white wealth gap in the U.S., and one of the original kind of causes, well, not original, one of the a primary contributor to that has been this this redlining that occurred within our urban centers and sponsored by the U.S. government. That's all for today. Please encourage you to look through the rest of the chapter and the PowerPoint to obtain the relevant material for our quizzes and tests. Thanks for listening.